Human helps the alien girl control her pheromone surge, and the alien girl says the surge follows him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Ethan Carson was an ordinary guy. At least, that's what he thought. A 28-year-old research scientist, Ethan had always been intrigued by the mysteries of the universe, but never in his wildest dreams did he think he would be part of one. He had always seen himself as more of a quiet observer, spending his days studying the stars and the unknown, trying to understand things others couldn't. But everything changed the day Isla Varan entered his life. Isla was no ordinary being. She wasn't even from Earth. She had come to this planet on a mission from her distant world, a world far beyond the reach of human imagination. Ethan first met her in a laboratory designed for the most advanced extraterrestrial studies. He had read about alien life forms, of course, but this was different. Isla was standing right in front of him, her ethereal blue skin almost glowing under the laboratory lights, her silver-white hair cascading down her shoulders, and her bright, almost otherworldly eyes staring back at him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She wasn't sure how to interact with humans, and that uncertainty was clear. But it wasn't her appearance that unsettled Ethan. It was the strange aura around her. Something about her presence felt off. It wasn't until later that Ethan learned about the true reason behind it. Isla's pheromones, powerful chemical signals she could not control. They surged unpredictably, a gift and a curse of her species. Whenever Isla's emotions got too intense, the pheromones would overflow, causing strange reactions in those around her. And when Ethan was around, something unusual happened. The surge seemed to follow him. It wasn't just his curiosity about her that drew him in. There was something more, something he couldn't explain. And as much as he tried to ignore it, the pheromones affected him too, leaving him conflicted about the growing bond between them. But Isla wasn't just another alien. She had been raised with strict control over her abilities. But the overwhelming surge of emotions and pheromones had disrupted everything she had been taught. She was frightened of herself, and of what she might do to those around her. Ethan, on the other hand, was determined to help. He could see the confusion in her eyes, and he understood that if she didn't learn to control the surge, it could be disastrous, not just for her, but for everyone around her. So, despite his growing feelings of unease, Ethan made the decision to help her. Little did he know, this decision would lead to a deeper connection between them, one that neither could predict and one that would change both of their lives forever. It had only been a few days since Ethan and Isla began working together, but it already felt like an eternity. The strange connection between them was undeniable, though neither of them fully understood what it meant. The pheromone surge was still an unpredictable challenge, and every time Isla's emotions got the better of her, it affected Ethan in ways he couldn't explain. He had tried to keep his distance, to focus solely on helping her control the surge, but that became harder with each passing day. Isla's presence had a way of pulling him in, and he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility for her. He had spent hours reading research papers, trying to find a solution, but nothing seemed to work. Isla's pheromone abilities were unlike anything he had ever studied. Her species had evolved to use pheromones as a means of communication and survival, but for Isla, it was a curse. She had learned to keep it under control when she was with her people, but Earth was different. The emotions and stimuli here seemed to trigger the surge in ways she couldn't anticipate. One afternoon, they sat in the lab, reviewing data. Isla was quiet, as usual, but Ethan could sense something was off. He looked over at her, noticing how tense her shoulders were. Isla, what's wrong? He asked, his voice gentle but full of concern. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know. It's just, the more I try to control it, the worse it gets. Ethan could hear the frustration in her voice. It was clear she felt trapped by her own abilities, and that feeling of helplessness was something he could relate to. I understand, he said, leaning forward. But you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. Isla looked at him, Her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and doubt. But how? What if it never stops? What if I hurt someone? Ethan's heart ached for her. He knew she was scared, but he also knew that fear would only make things worse. We'll take it one step at a time, he reassured her. We'll work through it, and I promise you, we'll find a way to control it. The conversation lingered in the air as they sat in silence. Ethan couldn't help but notice the way Isla's pheromones seemed to shift whenever she was near him. It wasn't just the normal subtle scent of an alien species. It was something more, something personal. He had read about how pheromones could affect relationships between different species, but he hadn't expected it to be this strong. Ethan didn't fully understand it, but he felt it every time she was near. The pull was unmistakable. For Isla, the pheromone surge was a reflection of her emotions, a way for her to express what words couldn't. She had never felt this way before, and it scared her. She had always kept her emotions in check, but being around Ethan made everything feel more intense. She had never met anyone like him. The way he looked at her, the way he listened, it all made her feel things she couldn't explain. As much as she tried to push those feelings aside, they lingered, and with each passing moment, they grew stronger. The pheromones followed him, no matter how hard she tried to keep them in check. Ethan could sense the change in the air, the shift in the atmosphere between them. He wasn't sure what it meant, but he knew something was happening, something bigger than either of them realized. The more time they spent together, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that their bond was not just about science or helping her control her powers. There was something deeper, something that tied them together in a way that was beyond explanation. Isla's struggle with her pheromones had become more than just a scientific puzzle. It had become personal. And as Ethan looked at her, he realized that he was no longer just helping her out of a sense of duty. He was helping her because he cared. But Isla was still uncertain. She didn't know if she could trust the feelings growing inside her, and she definitely didn't know how Ethan felt. Was this bond they shared just an effect of the pheromones, or was there something more? Only time would tell, but for now, all they could do was take it one step at a time. Days passed, and Isla's pheromone surges became increasingly difficult to manage. The more she tried to keep them under control, the more they seemed to intensify. Ethan spent hours researching, analyzing, and experimenting, but it felt like no solution was quite right. He could sense her frustration, her fear of not being able to control something so powerful inside her. It weighed heavily on both of them. One evening, they sat together in the lab, the dim lights casting long shadows across the room. Ethan looked up from his notes and saw Isla staring out the window, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. Isla, Ethan called gently, breaking the silence. She turned toward him, her silver-white hair shimmering under the soft light. I don't think this is working, she said, her voice strained. Ethan put down his pen and stood, walking over to where she sat. What do you mean? He asked, his tone sincere. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. Every time I try to control it, it only gets worse. I feel like I'm losing control of everything. It's not just the pheromones anymore, it's me. Ethan knelt beside her, his heart aching for her. He could see the turmoil in her eyes, the vulnerability she was trying to hide. You're not alone in this, he said softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure it out together. Isla didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause, she looked up at him, her gaze searching his face. Do you really think we can? That I can control it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded firmly. I know we can, but it's not going to happen overnight. It'll take time, patience, and trust. But we can do it. I believe in you. Isla looked at him for a moment, as if considering his words. Then, without a word, she stood up and walked over to a table filled with research papers and diagrams. She began to pace, her movements restless. Ethan watched her, sensing her internal struggle. He knew she didn't just fear the pheromones, but also what they represented. They were a symbol of her inability to fully connect with the world around her. In her mind, she wasn't just fighting an uncontrollable ability. She was fighting her own sense of isolation. Ethan, too, understood the weight of that feeling. He had spent so much of his life alone, studying the universe, that he often felt disconnected from those around him. But being with Isla had changed that. He didn't want her to feel the same way he did. He wanted to help her find a way to live with her abilities, not as something to be feared, but as a part of who she was. As Isla stopped pacing and turned back to him, Ethan could see a glimmer of something new in her eyes. It wasn't the fear or uncertainty he had seen before. Instead, there was a spark of determination. "I want to try again," she said, her voice steadier now. Ethan smiled, relieved. "We'll take it one step at a time," he replied, feeling a renewed sense of hope. Over the next few days, they began testing different methods to help Isla control her pheromone surges. They experimented with meditation, breathing exercises, and even communication techniques that might help her focus her emotions. Each time Isla's pheromones flared, Ethan was there, guiding her through the process. Slowly, they began to make progress. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Isla felt like giving up. But with each small success, the bond between them grew stronger. And in those quiet moments, when Isla was able to calm the storm inside her, Ethan realized that it wasn't just her pheromones that he had been helping her control. It was her fear. It was the fear of being different, of being alone, that she had been carrying with her all her life. And together, they were learning to overcome it. It has been weeks since Ethan and Isla first started their journey together, and although progress was slow, they were beginning to see results. Isla had grown more comfortable with the breathing exercises and meditation techniques Ethan had suggested, but it was clear that her emotions were still unpredictable. One evening, after another long session of attempts to control her pheromone surge, they found themselves in a quiet moment, sitting across from each other in the lab. The tension in the air was palpable, but this time, it was different. Isla had stopped fighting the surge. Instead, she was trying to understand it, to accept that it was a part of her. "I never thought it would be this difficult," Isla said, her voice almost lost in the silence. Ethan looked at her, his expression softening. "I know it's hard, but you're doing great. You're learning to control it, one step at a time." Isla sighed, a sound full of frustration and exhaustion. "But what if it's never enough? What if I can't ever fully control it?" She looked down at her hands, as though the weight of her fear was too much to bear. Ethan stood up, walking over to her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a small, reassuring smile. "It's not about perfection," he said quietly. "It's about progress. And I think you've made a lot of progress." Isla met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity in his words, but it was still hard to believe. "I don't know if I can ever stop it completely. I don't know if I can be the person I want to be, with this power inside me." Ethan could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the raw fear of being too different, too dangerous. He could relate more than she knew. He, too, had spent much of his life feeling like he didn't belong. But in Isla, he saw something else, a strength that she didn't even realize she had. "You don't have to be perfect," Ethan said, his voice firm yet gentle. "You're not alone in this. We're in this together." Isla looked at him, a flicker of something changing in her expression. She could feel the weight of his words, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to relax. There was something in his voice, something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she could learn to live with her abilities. The next few days were filled with more practice, but there was a shift in Isla. She stopped pushing herself so hard, stopped seeing her pheromone surges as something to be feared. Instead, she started embracing the idea that they were just another part of her, like her abilities, her emotions, her uniqueness. One afternoon, as they worked together in the lab, Ethan noticed a subtle change. For the first time since they began their sessions, Isla seemed at peace. She was still cautious, still aware of her pheromone surges, but she no longer felt overwhelmed by them. She had found a rhythm, a way to center herself before the emotions could take over. "How does it feel?" Ethan asked, watching her closely. Isla paused, a small smile forming on her lips. "It feels manageable," she said softly. Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of pride for her. "You're doing great. I knew you could do it." Isla's smile grew, her confidence beginning to shine through. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. Ethan smiled back at her, feeling a warmth that went beyond the satisfaction of their work. It wasn't just about the pheromone surges anymore. It was about something deeper, something he hadn't realized until now. He cared for her, not just as a scientist helping her control an alien ability, but as someone who truly wanted to see her succeed, someone who saw her for who she was, not just her powers. For Isla, the journey was far from over. She still had a long way to go, But in this moment, she felt like she was finally on the right path. Together, they had made progress, and together, they would continue to face whatever came next. Slowly but surely, Isla was learning to embrace her true self. It had been another week of steady progress for Isla, and the improvements were more than just visible. They were tangible. The once overwhelming surges of pheromones had become more manageable. She no longer felt like a prisoner to her own emotions, and though the struggle wasn't over, she was starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Ethan had been there with her every step of the way. Their sessions had evolved from frantic attempts at controlling her surges to peaceful practices, where Isla could pause and center herself before anything spiraled out of control. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. They had made a routine, a quiet rhythm between them, and with every passing day, Isla felt herself gaining more confidence. One afternoon, after yet another successful practice, Isla turned to Ethan with a soft smile. "I think I'm finally starting to understand it," she said, her voice steady, with just a hint of excitement. Ethan looked up from his notes, his expression softening. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice full of pride. "I knew you could do it." Isla laughed softly, a sound that seemed to fill the room with warmth. "It's funny," she said, her tone light. "I spent so much time trying to control it like it was something to be ashamed of. But now, I think I'm starting to see it differently." Ethan tilted his head, curious. "How do you see it now?" Isla paused, as though carefully choosing her words. "It's part of who I am. It doesn't have to control me, but it's a part of me. I think I can live with it, now that I've learned to accept it." Ethan smiled, his heart lifting at her words. For the first time, it seemed like Isla was truly at peace with herself. He could see the difference in the way she carried herself. The fear and uncertainty had faded, replaced with quiet strength. It was a breakthrough, and it made Ethan realize just how far they had come, not just in terms of her pheromone surges, but in their relationship as well. Over the past weeks, they had spent countless hours together, not just working on controlling her powers, but learning about each other. Ethan found himself more and more drawn to Isla, not just because of her abilities, but because of who she was. He admired her strength, her vulnerability, and the way she had embraced her differences. He had never met anyone like her. And as much as he tried to keep his feelings in check, there was no denying the bond that had grown between them. Isla, too, had begun to see Ethan in a new light. The more time they spent together, the more she found herself drawn to him, not just as a scientist, but as someone who truly cared about her. She had always been so focused on controlling her powers, on being perfect, that she hadn't allowed herself to see the possibility of something more. But now, with each passing day, she found herself thinking about him in ways she hadn't expected. Still, she couldn't quite bring herself to acknowledge it. She didn't want to complicate things, not when she had finally started to find some semblance of peace. But Ethan had a way of making her feel understood in a way no one else ever had. One evening, after another successful practice, they found themselves alone in the lab once again. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of machines in the background. Ethan looked up at Isla, his eyes meeting hers. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice gentle. Isla took a deep breath, considering his question. "I feel like I'm starting to believe in myself again," she said quietly. "And I couldn't have done it without you." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He had always tried to keep things professional, but in that moment, the words came out before he could stop them. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just happy to be here for you." Isla looked at him, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. Something shifted in the air between them, something unspoken but felt. Ethan could sense it too, the subtle change in the atmosphere, the way their connection had deepened over time. He couldn't help but wonder what it all meant, and if it was something neither of them were ready to face. But for now, they didn't speak of it. They simply continued on, each finding comfort in the other's presence. It was enough. For now, it was enough. It had been another week of steady progress for Isla, and the improvements were more than just visible. They were tangible. The once overwhelming surges of pheromones had become more manageable. She no longer felt like a prisoner to her own emotions, and though the struggle wasn't over, she was starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Ethan had been there with her every step of the way. Their sessions had evolved from frantic attempts at controlling her surges to peaceful practices, where Isla could pause and center herself before anything spiraled out of control. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. They had made a routine, a quiet rhythm between them, and with every passing day, Isla felt herself gaining more confidence. One afternoon, after yet another successful practice, Isla turned to Ethan with a soft smile. "I think I'm finally starting to understand it," she said, her voice steady, with just a hint of excitement. Ethan looked up from his notes, his expression softening. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice full of pride. "I knew you could do it." Isla laughed softly, a sound that seemed to fill the room with warmth. "It's funny," she said, her tone light. "I spent so much time trying to control it like it was something to be ashamed of. But now, I think I'm starting to see it differently." Ethan tilted his head, curious. "How do you see it now?" Isla paused, as though carefully choosing her words. "It's part of who I am. It doesn't have to control me, but it's a part of me. I think I can live with it, now that I've learned to accept it." Ethan smiled, his heart lifting at her words. For the first time, it seemed like Isla was truly at peace with herself. He could see the difference in the way she carried herself. The fear and uncertainty had faded, replaced with quiet strength. It was a breakthrough, and it made Ethan realize just how far they had come, not just in terms of her pheromone surges, but in their relationship as well. Over the past weeks, they had spent countless hours together, not just working on controlling her powers, but learning about each other. Ethan found himself more and more drawn to Isla, not just because of her abilities, but because of who she was. He admired her strength, her vulnerability, and the way she had embraced her differences. He had never met anyone like her. And as much as he tried to keep his feelings in check, there was no denying the bond that had grown between them. Isla, too, had begun to see Ethan in a new light. The more time they spent together, the more she found herself drawn to him, not just as a scientist, but as someone who truly cared about her. She had always been so focused on controlling her powers, on being perfect, that she hadn't allowed herself to see the possibility of something more. But now, with each passing day, she found herself thinking about him in ways she hadn't expected. Still, she couldn't quite bring herself to acknowledge it. She didn't want to complicate things, not when she had finally started to find some semblance of peace. But Ethan had a way of making her feel understood in a way no one else ever had. One evening, after another successful practice, they found themselves alone in the lab once again. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of machines in the background. Ethan looked up at Isla, his eyes meeting hers. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice gentle. Isla took a deep breath, considering his question. "I feel like I'm starting to believe in myself again," she said quietly. "And I couldn't have done it without you." Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. He had always tried to keep things professional, but in that moment, the words came out before he could stop them. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just happy to be here for you." Isla looked at him, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than usual. Something shifted in the air between them, something unspoken but felt. Ethan could sense it too, the subtle change in the atmosphere, the way their connection had deepened over time. He couldn't help but wonder what it all meant, and if it was something neither of them were ready to face. But for now, they didn't speak of it. They simply continued on, each finding comfort in the other's presence. It was enough. For now, it was enough. It had been a few days since Ethan and Isla's conversation in the lab, and both of them were starting to feel the weight of unspoken words. Isla had made significant strides in learning to control her pheromone surges, but there was something else between them now. Something subtle, yet undeniable. Every glance they exchanged seemed to linger a bit longer than before, and each word felt heavier with meaning. Isla couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew things were different. As they worked together, she found herself more aware of Ethan's presence. It wasn't just his guidance she appreciated, there was something else. Something that made her heart race when he smiled, or when their eyes met across the room. She had always been careful not to get too attached, not to let herself feel anything beyond the professional bond they shared. But lately, it was becoming harder to ignore the growing connection between them. Ethan, too, felt the change. He had always admired Isla's strength, but now, he found himself drawn to her in a way that went beyond their work. There was something about her, something more than the alien abilities she was learning to control. It was the way she carried herself now, more confident, more at ease with who she was. But he couldn't help but wonder if she felt the same pull, or if it was just his imagination. He had spent so long focusing on the scientific aspects of their work together that he hadn't given much thought to his feelings. But now, every time she laughed or smiled at him, it felt like something shifted inside him. One afternoon, as they were finishing up their session, Isla turned to Ethan with a question. "Do you ever wonder if this is all, more than just us trying to figure out my pheromones?" she asked, her voice cautious but curious. Ethan paused, taken aback by the question. He had been so focused on the technical aspects of their work that he hadn't really considered the deeper implications. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. Isla hesitated before answering, as though weighing her words carefully. "I mean, what if there's more to it than just helping me control this power? What if we're changing because of it?" Ethan stared at her, his heart skipping a beat. He knew exactly what she meant. He could feel it too, but he wasn't sure how to respond. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice soft. "But maybe it's not something we have to figure out right now. We've come this far, and we're still learning. Whatever this is, we'll take it one step at a time." Isla looked at him, her gaze softening. She wasn't sure what she had expected from him, but his response felt right. It wasn't about rushing into anything. It was about allowing things to unfold naturally. She had spent so much of her life controlling everything, fighting against her abilities and her emotions. But now, in this moment, she realized that some things couldn't be controlled. Some things had to be felt. Ethan and Isla spent the next few days continuing their sessions, but the air between them felt different. There was an unspoken understanding, a new layer to their connection that neither of them could deny. They didn't talk about it, didn't need to, but it was there, in the way they worked together, in the way they supported each other. Every time Isla managed to control a surge, Ethan's pride in her was evident in his eyes. Every time Ethan helped her calm her emotions, Isla felt a quiet sense of gratitude, something deeper than she had ever felt before. As the days passed, the bond between them grew stronger, and though neither of them was ready to acknowledge it, they both knew that things had changed. They were no longer just two people working together. They were something more, something neither of them fully understood yet, but both of them felt. And as much as they tried to focus on the work at hand, neither of them could deny that the path they were on together was leading them somewhere unexpected. It had been days since the museum visit, and Jason couldn't shake the feeling that everything between him and Laura had changed. It wasn't just the tension that lingered between them, it was the unspoken understanding. She was the Queen's proxy, but there was more to her than just that. As he continued to guard her, Jason found himself increasingly aware of how her presence seemed to affect him. The way she moved, the way she spoke, everything about her captivated him in a way he hadn't anticipated. She was not just a bodyguard's charge. She was someone with her own thoughts, her own desires, and a vulnerability that was all too real. The more time he spent with her, the more Jason saw past her royal duties, past the layers of formality. He saw the woman behind the position, the person who was more than just a stand-in for the Queen. Laura, for her part, seemed to sense the shift as well. Her laughter had become more genuine, her movements more relaxed, and she often sought his company when the duties of the day were done. Jason knew the professional line was getting harder to draw, but he couldn't help it. There was something about Laura that made him feel connected to her in a way he hadn't expected. One evening, after a particularly long day of diplomatic meetings and official ceremonies, Jason found himself alone in a quiet part of the palace with Laura. They had just finished an exhausting round of meetings with Earth's top officials. Laura had been mostly silent during the discussions, but Jason had noticed her eyes often drifting to the artwork in the rooms. Tonight, she seemed quieter than usual. "Are you all right?" Jason asked, his voice breaking the silence. Laura turned to face him, her deep blue eyes studying him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "I'm fine," she said softly, but there was something in her tone that didn't match her words. "It's just, sometimes I wonder if this life was ever meant for me." Jason's brows furrowed as he stepped closer. "What do you mean?" Laura sighed, a sound heavy with emotion. "Being a proxy, I was made for this role, but sometimes it feels like I'm nothing more than an imitation of someone else. The Queen has her responsibilities, her power, her place. And then there's me, just standing in for her." Jason didn't know how to respond at first. The weight of her words hung in the air between them. "You're more than just a stand-in," he said quietly, his voice soft but firm. "I see you. I see who you are. Not just as the Queen's proxy, but as yourself. Lara's eyes flickered with something. Was it surprise? Hope. You really think so? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Jason replied, his voice steady. I've never met anyone like you. You're more than just your title. You're real. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed charged with an unspoken understanding, a connection that neither of them could deny. Lara stepped closer, her hand brushing against his arm. You've made me feel more alive than I have in years, she said, her voice barely audible. Jason's heart raced, and for a moment, he wondered if he had crossed a line. But he couldn't step back now, not when the pull between them was so strong. I just don't know how this will end, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. But I know I can't ignore how I feel about you. Lara looked at him, her expression a mix of uncertainty and something deeper, something more vulnerable. We're both bound by duty, she said softly. But sometimes, duty isn't enough. Sometimes, it's about what's real. Jason swallowed hard, taking in her words. He knew she was right. This was real, what they shared, what they were beginning to feel for each other. I don't know what's going to happen, Jason said, his voice low and steady. But I know I don't want to walk away from this. Lara smiled, her expression softening. Neither do I, she whispered, and in that moment, everything shifted. They were no longer just a bodyguard and a proxy. They were two people, connected by something more than duty, more than obligation. They were something real, something worth fighting for.